Hello BookTube. Today I want to talk about the long list for the 2024 Cundill History Prize. The Cundill History Prize is one of the most prestigious book prizes focusing on history writing. The long list was announced on August 1st. The shortlist will be announced on September 5th. The finalists will be announced on October 3rd, and the winner will be announced on October 30th. It's been a few weeks since the long list was announced, and I had meant to comment on it. But I recently moved, and I wasn't entirely sure how I wanted to approach the Cundill History Prize. I have been following the prize for a few years now, and I don't know to what extent I really should be following the prize. I intended last year to follow the prize from the long list, and that didn't turn out so great. In 2022, I followed the short list, and while it was a bit more successful, I did burn out in the second half of the short list. And in 2021, I just read the finalists in one of the other shortlisted books, although those were read in 2022. So I'm not entirely sure how I want to approach the 2024 prize. Maybe this video will give me some clues to whether I just want to check out any books that might interest me or what. But regardless, I will report back what I decide. Now, on to the long list for the 2024 Cundill History Prize. And apologies in advance if I end up flubbing the list because the authors are listed first, and then the book in question, and then the publishers, depending on whether or not the books have different publishers in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. So let's get going. Judgement at Tokyo, World War II on Trial and the Making of Modern Asia by Gary J. Bass, published by Picador and Pan Macmillan. They Called It Peace, Worlds of Imperial Violence by Lauren Benton, published by Princeton University Press. Shadows at Noon, The South Asian 20th Century by Joya Chatterji, published by The Bodley Head, Vintage, and Yale University Press. Native Nations, A Millennium of North America by Kathleen DuVal, published by Penguin Random House. Smoke and Ashes, Opium's Hidden Histories by Amitav Ghosh, published by John Murray and Hachette. Lucky Valley, Edward Long and the History of Racial Capitalism by Catherine Hall, published by Cambridge University Press. France on Trial, The Case of Marshal Pétain by Julian Jackson, published by Belknap Press. Remembering Peasants, A Personal History of a Vanished World by Patrick Joyce, published by Scribner. Vagabond Princess, The Great Adventures of Gulbadan by Ruby Lal, published by Yale University Press. Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture and Control in Cold War America by Andrew C. McKevitt, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Before the Movement, The Hidden History of Black Civil Rights by Dylan C. Penningroth, published by Leverright Publishing. The Lumumba Plot, The Secret History of the CIA in a Cold War Assassination by Stuart A. Reid, published by Alfred A. Knopf. Revolusi, Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World by David Van Reybrouck, published by The Bodley Head, Vintage, and W.W. Norton. So, of that long list, none of the books immediately jump out to me as being in my wheelhouse. My historical wheelhouse is mostly the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt. The books seem to be mostly modern and near contemporary history. Some of the books I have heard of before, I think Judgement at Tokyo and Revolusi were at various points in my wish list. I've heard of Amitav Ghosh before, and I think I've also heard of France on Trial. I think I've heard of that one. And I know Lumumba has had several books out recently about him, not by him. But the rest of them are rather new to me. So I'm now going to go to my Amazon wish list, my research wish list. I have a number of wish lists on Amazon where I have collected the long listed books. If you are interested in checking these books out yourself, I recommend typing in the author's name in addition to the title. You will be that will give you the best success in getting the book. Several times while tapping in just the title, Amazon offered up things that were most certainly not the book in question. Many times, not even books were included in what Amazon was offering. So, anyway, let's get going. So, Judgement at Tokyo, World War II on Trial in the Making of Modern Asia by Gary J. Bass. In the weeks after Japan finally surrendered to the Allies to end World War II, the world turned to the question of how to move on from years of carnage and destruction. For Henry Truman, Douglas MacArthur, Chiang Kai-shek, and their fellow victors, the question of justice seemed clear. Japan's militaristic leaders needed to be tried and punished for the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, shocking atrocities against civilians in China, the Philippines, and elsewhere, and rampant abuses of prisoners of war and notorious incidents such as the Bataan Death March. For the Allied powers, the trial was an opportunity to render judgment on their vanquished foes, but also to create a legal framework to prosecute war crimes and prohibit the use of aggressive war, building a more peaceful world under international law and American hegemony. For the Japanese leaders on trial, it was their chance to argue that their war had been waged to liberate Asia from Western imperialism, and that the court was victor's justice. For more than 2 years, lawyers for both parties presented their cases before a panel of clashing judges from China, India, the Philippines, and Australia, as well as the United States and European powers. The testimony ran from horrific accounts of brutality and the secret plans to attack Pearl Harbor to the Japanese military's threats to subvert the government if it sued for peace. Yet rather than clarity and unanimity, the trial brought complexity, dissents, and divisions that provoke international discord between China, Japan, and Korea to this day. Those courtroom tensions and contradictions could also be seen playing out across Asia as the trial unfolded in the crucial early years of the Cold War, from China's descent into civil war to Japan's successful post-war democratic elections to India's independence and partition. So that was Judgement at Tokyo, which sounded very interesting. I think I will keep it in the wish list. Next is They Called It Peace by Lauren Benton. Imperial conquest and colonization depended on pervasive raiding, slaving, and plunder. European empires amassed global power by asserting a right to use unilateral force at their discretion. They Called It Peace is a panoramic history of how these routines of violence remapped the contours of empire and reordered the world from the 15th to the 20th centuries. In an account spanning from Asia to the Americas, Lauren Benton shows how imperial violence redefined the very nature of war and peace. Instead of preparing lasting peace, fragile truces ensured an easy return to war. Serial conflicts and armed interventions projected a de facto state of perpetual war across the globe. Benton describes the seemingly limited war-sparked atrocities, from sudden massacres to long campaigns of dispossession and extermination. She brings vividly to life a world in which warmongers portrayed themselves as peacemakers, and Europeans imagined small violence as essential to imperial rule and global order. Next, Shadows at Noon by Joya Chatterji. This radically original and ambitious history of the Indian subcontinent explores the region's unique 20th century history and foregrounds the deep connections rather than the publicized fissures between the cultures of India and Pakistan. Taking the partitions of British India rather than the two world wars as the century's inflection points, Joya Chatterji examines how issues of nationalism, internal and external migration, and technological innovation contributed to South Asia's tumultuous 20th century. Chatterji weaves together elements of her autobiography and family history, stories of such legendary figures as Tagore, Jinnah, Gandhi, and Nehru, and in particular the accounts of many who were left behind and marginalized in relentless nation-building projects. Shadows at Noon. Next will be jumping to the end, Revolusi, Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World by David van Reybrouck. On a sunny Friday morning in August 1945, a handful of people raised a homemade cotton flag and on behalf of 68 million compatriots announced the birth of a new nation. With the fourth largest population in the world, inhabiting islands that span an eighth of the globe, Indonesia became the first country to rid itself of colonial rule after World War II. In this vivid history, renowned scholar and celebrated author of Congo, David van Reybrouck, captures a period of extraordinary tumult and chaos to tell the story of Indonesia's momentous revolution, known as the Revolusi. Encompassing several hundred years of history, he details the formation of the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese invasion that followed, and the young rebels who engaged in armed resistance once the occupation ended. British and Dutch troops were sent to restore order and keep peace, but instead ignited the first modern war of decolonization. America too became embroiled with the Indonesians' fierce struggle for freedom. This struggle inspired independence movements in Asia, Africa, and the Arab world, especially in the wake of Indonesia's monumental 1955 Bandung Conference, the first global conference without the West. The whole world had become involved in Revolusi, and the whole world was changed by it. Native Nations, A Millennium in North America by Kathleen DuVal. Long before the colonization of North America, indigenous Americans built diverse civilizations and adapted to a changing world in ways that reverberated globally. And as award-winning historian Kathleen DuVal vividly recounts, when Europeans did arrive, no civilization came to a halt because of a few wandering explorers, even when the strangers came well armed. A millennium ago, North American cities rivaled urban centers around the world in size. Then, following a period of climate change and instability, numerous smaller nations emerged, moving away from rather than toward urbanization. From this urban past, egalitarian government structures, diplomacy, and complex economies spread across North America. So when Europeans showed up in the 16th century, they encountered societies they did not understand, those having developed differently from their own, and whose power they often underestimated. For centuries afterward, indigenous people maintained an upper hand and used Europeans in pursuit of their own interests. In Native Nations, we see how Mohawks closely controlled trade with the Dutch and influenced global markets, and how Quapaws manipulated French colonists. Power dynamics shifted after the American Revolution, but indigenous people continued to command much of the continent's land and resources. Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa forged new alliances and encouraged a controversial new definition of Native identity, to attempt to wall off U.S. ambitions. The Cherokees created institutions to assert their sovereignty on a global stage, and the Kiowas used their power in the West to regulate the passage of white settlers across their territory. Smoke and Ashes by Amitav Ghosh. Let's make sure real quick I'm still recording, and sorry about this, but I do need a drink. Because sometimes if I speak too long, I end up getting a frog in my throat. So, Smoke and Ashes. When Amitav Ghosh began the research for his monumental cycle of novels, the Ibis Trilogy, he was startled to learn how the lives of the 19th century sailors and soldiers he wrote about were dictated not only by the currents of the Indian Ocean, but also by the precious commodity carried in enormous quantities on those currents, opium. Most surprising of all, however, was the discovery that his own identity and family history were swept up in the story. Smoke and Ashes is at once a travelogue, a memoir, and an essay in history, drawing on decades of archival research. In it, Ghosh traces the transformative effect the opium trade had on Britain, India, and China, as well as the world at large. The trade was engineered by the British Empire, which exported Indian opium to sell to China to redress their great trade imbalance, and its revenues were essential to the empire's financial survival. Following the profits further, Ghosh finds opium central to the origins of some of the world's biggest corporations, of America's most powerful families and prestigious institutions. from the Assers and Coolidges to the Ivy League and of contemporary globalism itself. Remembering Peasants by Joyce. What the skeleton is to anatomy, the peasant is to history, its essential hidden support. For over the past century and a half, and most notably over the last 70 years, the world has become increasingly urban, and the peasant way of life, the dominant way of life for humanity since agriculture began well over 6,000 years ago, is disappearing. In this vital history of peasantry, social historian Patrick Joyce aims to tell the story of this lost world and its people, and how we can commemorate their way of life. In one sense, this is a global history, ambitious in scope, taking us from the urbanization of the early 19th century to the present day. But more specifically, Joyce's focus is the demise of the European peasantry and their rights, traditions, and beliefs. Alongside this, he brings in stories of individuals as well as places, including his own family, and looks at how peasants and their ways of life have been memorialized in photographs, literature, and in museums. Joyce explores a people whose voice is vastly underrepresented and is usually mediated through others in human history, and how peasants are vanishing in one of the greatest historical transformations of our time. Okay, so we were just on peasants. So, Lucky Valley by Catherine Hall. Why does Edward Long's History of Jamaica matter? Written in 1774, Long's history, that most civilized of documents, attempts to define white and black as essentially different and unequal. Long deployed natural history and social theory, carefully mapping the island and drawing on poetry and engravings, and his efforts to establish a clear and fixed racialized hierarchy. His white family sat at the heart of Jamaican planter society and the West India trade in sugar, which provided the economic bedrock of this 18th century system of racial capitalism. Catherine Hall tells the story behind the history of a slave-owning family that prospered across generations together with the destruction of such possibilities for enslaved people. She unpicks the many contradictions in Long's thinking, exposing the insidious myths and stereotypes that have poisoned social relations over generations and allowed reconfigured forms of racial difference and racial capitalism to live on in contemporary societies. France on Trial by Julian Jackson. In the terrible month of October 1940, few things were more shocking than the sight of Marshal Philippe Pétain, supremely decorated hero of the First World War, now head of the French government, shaking hands with Hitler. Pausing to look at the cameras, Pétain announced that France would henceforth collaborate with Germany. "This is my policy," he intoned. "My ministers are responsible to me. It is I alone who will be judged by history." 5 years later, in July 1945, after a wave of violent reprisals following the liberation of Paris, Pétain was put on trial for his conduct during the war. He stood accused of treason, charged with heading a conspiracy to to destroy France's democratic government and collaborating with Nazi Germany. The defense claimed he had sacrificed his personal honor to save France and insisted he had shielded the French people from the full scope of Nazi repression. Former resistors called for the death penalty, but many identified with this conservative military hero who had promised peace with dignity. Vagabond Princess by Ruby Lal. Situated in the early decades of the magnificent Mughal Empire, this first ever biography of Princess Gulbadan offers an enthralling portrait of a charismatic adventurer and unique pictures of the multicultural society in which she lived. Following a migratory childhood that spanned Kabul and North India, Gulbadan spent her middle years in a walled harem established by her nephew Akbar to showcase his authority as the great emperor. Gulbadan longed for the exuberant, itinerant lifestyle she'd known. With Akbar's blessing, she led an unprecedented sailing and overland voyage and guided harem women on an extended pilgrimage to Arabia. Amid increasing political tensions, the women's un-Islamic behavior forced their return, lengthened by dramatic shipwreck in the Red Sea. Gulbadan wrote a book upon her return, the only extant work of prose by a woman of the age. A portion of it is missing, either lost to history or redacted by officials who did not want the princess to have her say. Gun Country by Andrew C. McKevitt. Just as World War II transformed the United States into a global military and economic superpower, so too did it forge the gun country America is today. After 1945, war-ravaged European nations possessed large surpluses of mass-produced weapons, and American entrepreneurs seized the opportunity to buy used munitions for pennies on the dollar and resell them stateside. A booming consumer market made cheap guns accessible to millions of Americans, and rates of gun ownership and violence began to climb. Andrew C. McKevitt tells us the history of this gun boom through the dynamics of consumer capitalism and Cold War ideology, the combination of which resulted in a vast number of Americans arming themselves to the teeth and centering the political identity on their guns. When gun control legislation emerged in the 1960s, many Americans, accustomed to the unregulated post-war bounty of cheap guns and fearful of Soviet invasion, domestic subversion, and urban uprisings, fiercely challenged it. Meanwhile, gun control groups were diverted from their abolitionist roots toward a conciliatory, fundraising-focused strategy that struggled to limit the stockpiling of firearms. Gun Country recasts the story of guns in post-war America as one of Cold War and racial anxieties, unfettered capitalism, and exceptional violence that continues to haunt us to this day. Before the Movement by Dylan C. Penningroth. The familiar story of civil rights goes like this. Once America's legal system shut Black people out and refused to recognize their rights, their basic human dignity, or even their very lives. When lynch mobs gathered, police and judges often closed their eyes if they didn't join in. For Black people, law was a hostile, fearsome power to be avoided whenever possible. Then, starting in the 1940s, a few brave lawyers ventured south, bent on changing the law. Soon, ordinary African Americans, awakened by Supreme Court victories and galvanized by racial justice activists, launched the civil rights movement. In Before the Movement, acclaimed historian Dylan C. Penningroth brilliantly revises a conventional story. Drawing on long-forgotten sources found in the basements of county courthouses across the nation, Penningroth reveals that African Americans, far from being ignorant about law until the middle of the 20th century, have thought about, talked about, and used it going as far back as even the era of slavery. They dealt constantly with the laws of property, contract, inheritance, and marriage and divorce, of associations like churches and businesses, and activist groups, and more. By exercising these rights of everyday use, Penningroth demonstrates they made Black rights seem unremarkable. And in innumerable ways, they helped shape the law itself, the laws all of us live under today. And finally, The Lumumba Plot by Stuart A. Reid. It was supposed to be a moment of great optimism, a cause for jubilation. The Congo was at last being set free from Belgium, one of 17 countries to gain independence in 1960 from ruling European powers. At the helm as Prime Minister was charismatic nationalist Patrice Lumumba. Just days after the handover, however, the Congo's new army mutinied. Belgian forces intervened, and Lumumba turned to the United Nations for help in saving his newborn nation from what the press was already calling the Congo crisis. Dag Hammarskjöld, the tidy Swede serving as UN General Secretary General, quickly arranged the organization's biggest peacekeeping mission in history. But chaos was still spreading. Frustrated with the fecklessness of the United Nations and spurned by the United States, Lumumba then approached the Soviets for help. An appeal that set off alarm bells at the CIA. To forestall the spread of communism in Africa, the CIA sent word to its station chief in the Congo, Larry Devlin, Lumumba had to go. Within a year, everything would unravel. The CIA plot to murder Lumumba would fizzle out, but he would be deposed in a CIA-backed coup, transferred to enemy territory in a CIA-approved operation, and shot dead by Congolese assassins. Hammarskjöld too would die in a mysterious plane crash en route to negotiate a ceasefire with the Congo's rebellious southeast. And a young, ambitious military officer named Joseph Mobutu, who had once sworn fealty to Lumumba, would seize power with U.S. help and misrule the country for more than 3 decades. For the Congolese people, the events of 1960 to 1961 represented the opening chapter of a long horror story. For the U.S. government, however, they provided a playbook for future interventions. So that was the long list for the 2024 Cundill History Prize and a brief synopsis of each book. I'll report back when the long list is announced and go from there to see how I want to proceed with possibly which books I would like to pick up. From the descriptions, maybe 1 or 2 really jumped out at me, but this list is, at least on the surface, not one that I'm immediately gravitating to. So I will be back later with some more videos. So until then, thank you, BookTube. Have a great evening and stay safe.